Hello, good afternoon again. So this is part two of our interview. Hi, so we're back, Jared, and we were talking about racial differences in pre-colonial Africa and in slavery, and these differences not being recent. There is a paper. This paper has not been noticed by the right eyes. I might write a piece on it. The
Mm.
paper was published by somebody called Peterson. He was examining the relationship between cold climates, brain size, and the peer bonding. He doesn't mention Richard Lynn any at all, but his conclusions endorse the Lynn thesis. He said that colder climates do lead to bigger brains and peer bonding. So what's your take on this?
It's to me a very convincing explanation of how evolution produced the kinds of ethnic and racial differences that we see. Clearly, the idea is that if you are evolving in a very cold and challenging environment, you have to be able to think ahead. And certainly, if in order to eat, you have to cooperate with others and bring down large animals such as mammoths, you have to have a certain amount of cooperation. You have to be unselfish to a certain degree, share the meat that results from a group hunt. And also, if you are farming, then you have to be very careful to save a certain amount of your crop so that you can plant the next year. All of these challenges force a human group to evolve in a way that is more forward thinking, more intelligent, and at the same time, in order for women to survive, they have to find some way to keep the man around. A woman who gets pregnant, certainly in a challenging environment, and who has a child and has no man to look after her, and winter's coming on. That is a very, very dangerous state of affairs.
And they
So
also become more empathetic.
yes, yes. They realize that we need the help of others, and so we should give others the help that we would need in similar circumstances. The theory, of course, is in a tropical environment where food is likely to be more abundant, where a woman with a child can perhaps subsist without the help of a man. You don't have to plan ahead to the same degree. There need not be the same level of pair bonding because a woman can survive without the help of a man. I think all of these things are generally quite convincing. There are a certain number of exceptions. Obviously, people wonder, well, what's the story on Eskimos? Eskimos have lived in a very, very demanding, cold environment for a long time. And to the point that they have developed certain abilities that are very unusual among other groups. They can navigate in very snowy, featureless environments. They can remember and recognize features of the landscape that would be utterly insignificant and unnoticed by people who are not Eskimos. Now, I don't know if that is something that comes from training. If you reared a Japanese, say, or I don't know, a Jamaican in the same environment, would they be able to recognize these aspects of the landscape? I don't know. But they are stocky so that they're not long limbed the way East Africans often are, so that they retain their heat. So they've been it's for all we can tell, they've been in a cold climate for a long time, but they have not developed the kind of high IQ that we find among East Asians and Caucasians. One proposed explanation for this is that the numbers were simply not large enough for those populations to give rise to the kind of mutation that's necessary for cranial development. I don't know. I'm not a specialist in this, but to me, that is one example of a case in which it doesn't seem to fit the theory. But in general, yes, the further you move from the equator, you are more likely to find forward planning, more likely to engage in pair bonding, all the kinds of the K versus R behavior that Phil Rushton writes about in his work.
No, I am laughing because Richard Lynn and Edward Miller, they responded to the Eskimo argument. So I don't know why people keep contending that the example of the Eskimos is creating a deficit in the Lynn literature. That's not the case. Others
Well,
have responded. And back to
yes,
your point about the equator and development, in economics, the consensus is that distance to the equator, or rather distance away from the equator, predicts higher levels of development. So the literature in economics is quite clear. Proximity to the equator predicts lower levels of development, and several studies have interrogated this thesis, and they have been replicated. The finding is often replicated. There's one study titled Sunlight Institutions and Diseases. There's a new study on sunlight and state capacity. But the environment is a robust predictor of development, and most people who live in these environments, unfortunately for them, they're not white. So these are usually not white environments. So
No.
Africa, Latin America, etc., these environments are not Western environments. So unfortunately, because of their environment, these are the outcomes. Yet people pretend like such studies don't exist.
Yes. Well, it's astonishing to me that the United States, which is a nation that prides itself on freedom of speech and speaking out and standing your ground, we are one in which there is an almost institutional obligation to suppress any study, any kind of knowledge that runs counter to this rigid, almost aggressive egalitarianism to which we are all obliged to subscribe. I don't know if you know the name Roland Fryer. He was
Yeah,
the
so yes,
youngest.
he's quite popular. Yes.
Yes, he was a young black. He was the youngest black professor ever to get tenure at Harvard, I believe. And he did a study on shootings of killings by police of people in the United States, broken down by race. And to his great surprise, I mean, he assumed that under the same circumstances, white police officers were more likely to shoot blacks and kill them than to kill whites. And he found the opposite. But this was so contrary to what Harvard wanted to believe that Claudine Gay, who was at that time, I believe, the dean, she was not yet president of Harvard, she essentially hounded him out of the university. The idea that a black man could come up with racist conclusions of this kind, or I suppose not racist, but conclusions that depicted whites as insufficiently racist, or perhaps not even racist at all. This was simply unacceptable. And so, as you point out, there are many good papers that have sound data. But so long as they lead to unpopular, unfashionable conclusions, they are very, very unlikely to get any widespread treatment. Whenever I see a new paper, often in an obscure journal, that again has excellent data, sound conclusions, but they run counter to the fashionable views, I say to myself, well, this will never be reported in the Washington Post, the New York Times, or on the television. Excuse me.
Yeah. And again, I'm laughing. So Jeffrey Williamson is a mainstream professor. He was the head of the economics department at Harvard. And Jeffrey Williamson is like the biggest myth buster in economic history. I interviewed him some years ago.
Mm.
Jeffrey's studies clearly argued that colonialism did not lead to inequality in Latin America. So Jeffrey has eviscerated that argument, but he's relatively mainstream.
Mm.
However, for Jeffrey to do that type of research today, the response would be different. So Jeffrey's lucky that he's an old man, like in his 80s, and he's not starting out today. But
Mm.
that type of research wouldn't be amenable to the establishment today.
No, no.
Yeah, so yeah,
But by the way, maybe you have already explained this to all of your listeners, and they would be bored to hear it all over again.
yeah.
But what is the Ed Miller counter to the idea that the phenomenon of Eskimos somehow undercuts the Lynn thesis? What's the argument there?
Yeah, so if you actually mentioned it, the population size. So Ed Miller's paper published by Mankind Quarterly, it was on
Yes,
racial mixing. I know racial mixing can lead to mutations that
yes.
induce higher intelligence. So you explained it already, and that's
Mhm.
fairly recent.
Yes, yes. Well, that's the only explanation with which I'm familiar.
Mm.
Uh, but very few theories uh, can cover, well, at least when we're talking about sociological theories, there are theories in physics that are almost never or maybe never violated. But in sociological matters, then there are very few theories that actually cover everything perfectly without any exceptions. But no, to me, the cold winters theory is a very convincing one. And it's significant to me that at one time, Wikipedia had a page, a fairly scholarly page devoted to cold winter theory of evolution. And they had both sides, and they went about the question in a fairly systematic way. But now, if you search for that question on Wikipedia, at least the last time I did, that page had been taken down. Wikipedia doesn't want anybody even thinking about that, much less hearing both sides.
Yes, but the cold winters is not that unusual. This has been the default position for a long time. People were always speculating that colder winters led
Yes.
to innovation.
I think
It's a default position.
you can go back to certain classical thinkers. I believe the Greeks, Strabo, for example, I believe some of them actually voiced that idea, 1,000 years ago. So no, it's not a new theory by any stretch of the imagination. 2,000 years ago, it just seems to make so much more sense. But be that as it may, no, just because something makes sense and explains the world does not mean that it's going to get the attention it deserves
Yeah.
in the United States of America today.
So I don't know if you know him. His name is Anthony Walsh. He's a distinguished and fairly old academic. And Anthony Walsh writes on biocrime and gene environmental interactions.
Mhm.
In his recent paper from Mankind Quarterly, he noted some relevant statistics. One, relative to participation in crime, Blacks are under arrested.
Yes,
That's a really important point. They're under arrested. They are less likely to comply with laws. That's why they're usually stopped. They're
yes,
more likely to attack whites, and they're not disproportionately killed by the police, but relative to their involvement in crime, they're under arrested. People
yes.
rarely belabor this point.
Well, anyone who looks into the statistics carefully, and I've been following crime statistics for a long time, can't help but discover this. But there was a fascinating study done several years ago, and I can't give you the precise numbers, but someone asked Americans in a poll how many unarmed black men did they think had been shot to death by the police in the previous year? And the correct number was at that year, maybe 17 or 20 or 18, maybe 12. I can't remember exactly. But the more liberal a person was, the larger he thought the number was, to the point that you have some significant percentage of the population among the ultra liberals who thought that the number of blacks shot to death, unarmed blacks shot to death by the police was maybe even 1,000. But 100 was a very common, 500, 300, very, very common ideas. Most people have no idea of what the facts are. There was a fellow who did, provocative videos. He was attending a BLM rally, and he made a point of going up to people and asking them, how many black people have been shot to death by the police this year or last year? And they don't know. And they would give these fantastic cuckoo answers, but then they would get angry that they were even being asked. The idea that their sense of virtue, their sense of righteous indignation should have some sort of factual basis. The implication of this was deeply insulting to them. And they threatened to beat him up and chase him away. It really makes for quite an amusing movie.
Yeah, yes, and what people never say is that even in the area of insecurity, and I'm deliberately using this word insecurity and population size, whites are more likely to be marginalized. So in the 1990s, or was it the late 80s, social problems, that journal published an article saying that when whites become a minority in a population, they are more likely to be penalized. And the article was explaining crime data and statistics and sentencing. And it said that when the white population was diminished, the whites were penalized. So if there's systemic racism, it's really affecting whites. But this paper was published in Social Problems years ago, maybe in 1990 or in the 1980s.
I'm not familiar with that
Maybe
paper
maybe I
either.
don't remember. It's an old paper, but it was saying
Yes.
that
Hmm.
whites are the ones who are penalized by the justice system when their percentage declines.
Well, I'm not looking forward to my children and grandchildren living as minorities in the United States. Sometimes, when white advocates such as myself are feeling despondent, we imagine that our children and grandchildren will be living in the equivalent of Zimbabwe or perhaps South Africa. Not a pleasant prospect, not at all a pleasant prospect. But ultimately, this is something that whites have brought upon themselves. And
Mm.
so it is true that, well, this is going off into a different direction. You haven't asked me about this, but the people who are the guardians of orthodoxy in the United States and who are horrified to hear anyone, whether me or you, say the kinds of things we're saying, they will always say that at least if you're white, you're motivated by hatred. You could have a curiosity about race differences in conjugal violence, for example, only because you hate Black people. I mean, this is utterly, utterly preposterous and absurd. I'm quite amused, by the way, the people of the Anti-Defamation League or the Southern Poverty Law Center apparently claim to read my mind because they will tell you, oh, this guy is a hater. He's motivated by hate. He hates Black people. And uh, it, it's just absurd. But I have met a few whites who, though they would never do anything violent to any non-white person, they do have a kind of resentment that I don't find attractive. Now, if I were to be resentful to anyone, it would be to the people of my own race who have perpetrated this on all of us, and those who have opened the doors to influx and have also invented all of these very, very dangerous myths that attribute only to white malevolence every single failing that we can ever detect among non-whites, especially Blacks. If, as I say, I were to feel any kind of resentment, I'm not a hating sort of a guy, but I suppose if I were, those are the people that I think would deserve my hatred.
It's funny that wokeness is prompting new debate. So since the latter part of last year and the earlier part of this year, more people have been talking about anti-white policies. So there's
Yes,
this new book out on white rage by Waldman. I don't think that I'm going to read it, but according to Facebook algorithm, there is anti-white rage leveled at the personality of white. So whites are the victims of racial hatred. They're more likely
yes.
to be victims of online racial hatred than
Oh,
other
yes.
races. A young immigrant, Laken Riley, she was killed, and a black lady said that she's not going to mourn her.
Right.
So if there is a group of people experiencing animus, that's really white people. People are more likely to genuflect to blacks.
Well, in a way, it's surprising that there's not more hatred of whites by Blacks. I think there's a considerable amount of it, but the United States, in effect, does everything within its power to tell Black people to hate whites, to teach them to hate whites. After all, we are assured that Black people are just as smart and hardworking and deserving as white people. And if they don't achieve at the same level, there is only one explanation, and that is vicious white racism, either in the past or in the present today. Likewise, that is now practically religion among most Blacks to believe that it was thanks to them and their ancestors, slaves, that the United States became a wealthy country.
Jared, this
Yes.
is my topic. Look at my finger. So I'm an
All right.
economic historian.
All right.
Blacks did not build the West.
No,
No, let me
no.
look. I don't want to belabor this point too much, but I'm really passionate about the topic. I
Well,
follow the studies like a robot.
well,
There's a new study out saying that the output of slaves was just over 10% of GDP. That's relatively large, but not super significant. Secondly, the Fogel studies show that even without railroads, America would have industrialized, and railroads are important. So if America would have industrialized without such a crucial type of infrastructure, why do people think that America needed slaves? After
well,
the abolition of slavery, the Southern economy continued to thrive, according to Gavin Wright. Blacks did not build America. England had a human capital advantage before colonialism, an institutional advantage, and better financial institutions. Blacks did not build England either.
no. And one of the obvious retorts is if blacks built America, when are they going to build Detroit? When are they going to build Haiti? When are they going to build West Africa?
Exactly.
For heaven's sake, if they're so fantastically productive, how come where they live, where they run the place, how come those places are not just Wakandas? No, it's a preposterous idea. But the number of blacks who believe this is quite astonishing.
Yes.
And a lot of it has to do with the timidity and the unwillingness of whites to say, look, for the following 25 reasons, what you're saying is completely cuckoo. Whites
It is.
don't dare say this.
No, there was an industrial revolution. There was a revolution in business practices. Europe experienced productivity growth and minimal economic growth before the colonial era. There's a paper by Broadberry and authors, 4 centuries of growth. I followed the literature. Blacks did not build Europe. The slave
No.
trade was profitable, but the gains were small, according to Engerman and Peter Emir. Peter Emir examined the Dutch slave trade. However, Europeans, they were better organized. That's why slavery and the slave trade were both more profitable in the West. In other parts of the world, slavery was not as scientifically oriented. Europeans applied scientific tools to promote the management of slavery.
Well, of course, there were many studies done by Yankees at the time in which they would go to the South and they were appalled at how unproductive they found slaves to be. There were industrialists in the North looking forward to emancipation so that they could hire these blacks and actually put them to work, really make them work, because they just seemed to be lazing around in the South as slaves. There was also an expression among Southerners, slave owners, that it takes two slaves to watch one slave do nothing.
Like in
Uh,
Jamaica, in
yes,
contemporary Jamaica, the expression is that one Chinese can do the work of five Jamaicans. So the Chinese are building
yes,
the road and they're doing a great job. And the Jamaican workers are just slouching around. And that side of the infrastructure project is not going
yes,
anywhere. That's what the people in rural
yes,
Jamaica say.
yes.
That's not what I'm saying. That's what they say.
Right. Well, but the only reason I bring this up is because so many blacks are convinced that the United States really should legitimately belong to them, that all of the wealth of America was created by their ancestors. And therefore, there is nothing that whites own that is not really legitimately should be the possession of blacks. This is not an unusual idea. And when I've gotten into discussions with blacks about racial separation, they warn me, well, you're going to be a whole lot poorer without us.
No.
Yes, they believe this. They believe this. They believe that America's wealth is just arrested from the sweat of their backs. And so that, you're going to have a hard time without us. Watch out. You better not want to leave. Good
No.
grief. No, well, how do you even begin to reason
No,
with people
the
like this?
biggest counter example, Liberia. They went to
Yes,
Liberia and look at Liberia today. I have an article up in Aporia on the issue.
yes.
They didn't build Liberia. They were unusually corrupt.
Yes, yes, yes. No, as I say, that was a remarkable thing about that conversation I had with the Liberian student. And at the time, I was quite shocked and horrified to think that, well, gosh, Liberia was primitive because it was not colonized by whites. But he says, oh, come on, it's obvious. I was utterly staggered by that. So,
Yeah.
but anyway,
And so look at reparations. If the cause of Black failure and Black antisocial problems are greater than the benefit of reparations, should they get it? No. They were already compensated. When you calculate the cost of Black failure, Black students failing, and Black crime, there is not an argument for reparations.
well, one of the perhaps most unkind arguments is to say, well, are you better off here now than you would be had your ancestors remained in Africa?
No, they would be slaves, and many of them would be followers of big men. That's
Yes,
all.
yes. Anyway, I can't stay that much longer. I'm going to have to attend a few other things, but are there any particular questions that you
Yeah,
had for me before we
one,
go?
I do you think that Black people should support white consciousness? That's the first question. And
Hmm.
secondly, there isn't evidence for white privilege, but I do think that there is evidence for white female privilege. They disproportionately benefit from affirmative action programs, white
Hmm.
females.
Hmm.
Maybe it's because of their sex, but you cannot just answer those two briefly.
Well, yes. As a matter of fact, whenever I have a serious conversation with a black person about white racial consciousness, that black people are much more likely to understand what I'm talking about than
Yes.
your average white liberal, because black people invariably or almost invariably have a racial consciousness of their own. And so when I, as a white man, talk about my feelings of loyalty to my race and my desire for my people to prosper, this is something that is not very difficult for them to understand. Now, some of them will think that they don't want white racial consciousness to arise because then it could lead to some kind of exclusion of blacks or exploitation of blacks. But I think many thoughtful black people, they recognize the importance of racial consciousness, the inevitability of racial consciousness, and they will support it or not, depending on how fair-minded they are as to the interests of whites. The kind of blacks that I'm talking about, if I'm talking about separation, they have no interest in the survival or the welfare of white people at all. They would be perfectly happy if we all disappeared tomorrow. But I think out of fair-mindedness, just as racially conscious white people should wish the best for black people. For example, I want black people to build the best possible societies they can. And ultimately, I believe that black people are much better off living in a nation that reflects their heritage, their values, their culture, rather than living as a minority in a largely white society in which they are constantly resentful. How can this be? How can this be a happy way to live?
No, I
Constant,
like living in the West. I
well,
like living in
okay,
the West, and white racial consciousness benefits me and other blacks because whites are lower in tribalism. If we get up tomorrow and Asians and Hispanics are occupying the most elite positions in America, they're not going to lobby for blacks.
no, 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 they're certainly not. Well, you see, then you can take advantage living in the West of the fact that white people have this lack of racial consciousness. They're unwilling to do the necessary work of exclusion. Let us not be shy about using that word. If whites are to survive, they have to have areas in which they are the indisputed majority. And that requires a certain kind of exclusion. It requires the ability of white people to say to others, look, we wish you well, but our ancestors built this for us. And unless we have a place for us, our people and our culture and our way of life, all of these will eventually disappear. So we're sorry, but you have to make your own way, and we'll be happy to help you in any way we can,
All right.
but you have to be on your side of the fence. This
But
is something,
before you go, quickly answer
yes.
the question on white women being privileged. They
Mm.
disproportionately benefit from affirmative action according to Box. I think that's convincing. thesis.
Yes, I think they probably do benefit from affirmative action. Another question would be, to what extent do homosexuals benefit from affirmative action? I mean, nobody's ever going to get any National Science Foundation grant to look into this, but this is also one of the plus marks. If you can claim to be a homosexual, or I don't know, transsexual or whatever it is, then you're going to be a desirable employee too. All of this is completely nuts, utterly and completely nuts.
Yeah,
But uh, all of this, I think, is to some extent partially due to the rise of women in decision-making positions in the United States. Women are much more likely to vote Democratic than men. Well, significantly more likely at any rate. And they are more likely to adhere to these crazy woke ideas. If you go to a racially conscious meeting here in the United States, it's going to be 85% men and maybe 15% women. There is something, women are
they're more
naturally, I think,
empathetic and less supportive of free speech and less
exactly.
systematic too.
That's absolutely 100% correct. In fact, if you look at surveys of American college students, women are the most ferociously anti-free speech group there is, even more so than blacks. I was very surprised to see pretty reliable survey data that found this. So to the extent that Western societies are governed by women, they're going to be governed in ways that are altruistic to the point of ultimately, I believe, the West committing suicide. So this is yet again
But they're
another.
already doing that. It's
Yes.
just like when feminists support men who rape women, immigrants. They support some immigrants who rape women.
This is so crazy. I have to believe that this is only a tiny, noisy fringe of women. Most women, surely at some level, even if this is a dark-skinned immigrant to whom they would otherwise consider one of their pets, if this person actually rapes people, good grief. But anyway, no, you're right. The women, sometimes they do astonishing things that we mere men have
Yes.
find unfathomable.
Yeah. So thanks for coming on, but I couldn't let you go without laughing. Uh, I'm laughing because of your interview with that Tariq person. I don't really know him. It was really hilarious. The Egyptians were not white. On my Twitter page, I actually said, what did Jared hope to achieve by doing this interview? Like the tree of logic, she's okay, but the Tariq guy, I just couldn't get him.
At first, I thought he was just joking with me. I thought he was giving me what Muhammad Ali used to call the rope-a-dope. I don't know if you know that expression. The rope-a-dope is you let the other guy think that he's landing blows, and you're just lying back on the rope, and you're fooling the guy by thinking that he's in a position. I thought this guy was giving me the rope-a-dope, but no, I think he genuinely believes these things. Although I'm still mystified to think later that he well, I just don't know. I can't say as I've troubled my mind too much as to whether or not he believes these things, but I suspect he does.
Maybe it does because George Washington Carver did not invent peanut butter. That's what Barry McIntosh said. Louis Latimer was smart, but he did not invent the light bulb. He improved the process. That's what he
Yes,
did. And you were
yes,
speaking to somebody, and the person said, do you know Louis Latimer? He was an innovator. And I was like, no, the filament bulb, that was not him. He refined
right.
it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, anyway, well, it's
Yeah.
been a pleasure to talk with you. And thank you so much for inviting me on your program.
All right. Bye. Thanks again.